Good afternoon. I'm Chris Scher, Member Communications Director of the Society of Broadcast Engineer and the co-host of this month's episode of the SBE WEBxtra, the SBE chapter of the web. This is a monthly meeting, usually held on the third Monday of the month. The SBE is the Association for Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Professionals, with about 5,000 members, mostly in the U.S., but also around the world. The SBE WEBxtra is sponsored by Katrine. Katrine, unique experience, individual solutions, reliable performance. The host of today's SBE WEBxtra is SBE board member Kirk Harnack, who is also the chair of the SBE Social Networking Committee. How you doing, Kirk?
I'm good. Thank you, Chris. Good to see you and good to see all of you this month on the SBE WEBxtra. You know, we just had this national program test, the EAS NPT, and that was last week, middle of last week. And our guest this week is Larry Wilkins. He's with the Alabama Broadcasters Association. And Larry's going to be here right after our member update to talk to us about what happened, what was supposed to happen, what did happen during the NPT, and we'll examine maybe some successes and some things that didn't go so well. And Larry will have some advice for us. Plus, he's going to talk to us about how the state of Alabama keeps track of many of the radio and TV stations and how they do in any testing situation. It's pretty interesting. Good technical implementation. So, Chris, I'm looking forward to that right after your member update.
Absolutely. And Larry is also the chair of the SBE EAS Advisory Group, so he wears a couple of hats for us. But as you mentioned, here's your SBE member update for August 16th, 2021. The SBE election is underway. Most members received their ballot links via email, and a test message was sent on July 7th. The voting link was sent on July 23rd, and a reminder with that same link was sent on August 4th. If you still haven't voted, you'll receive one more email voting reminder before the voting deadline of August 25th. Now, if you opted out of electronic voting, or if you don't have a valid email address with the SBE, a ballot was mailed to you. That ballot must be received in the SBE National Office by August 25th to be counted. If you're an SBE member and you haven't received your ballot, contact me right away at comms@sbe.org. That's COMMS at SBE.org. Officers serve one-year terms, and there is one candidate for each of the four positions. Board members serve two-year terms, and half the board seats are being voted on. There are 7 candidates running for the 6 seats. Don't put off voting any longer. Vote now and be sure your vote is counted. This year, the SBE launched a new series in webinars by SBE, the 2021 IP Networking Series. The first 7 parts are available on demand. Part 8, IP Network Troubleshooting, airs live on August 19th. Wayne Pacina leads these webinars. And also in August, on the 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Chris Crump, Senior Director of Sales and Marketing at Comrex, presents WebRTC, the Future of Communications. He'll discuss the basics of WebRTC and the multitude of applications that are already using it to change the way the world communicates. This is especially important in light of the rapid evaporation of traditional telco infrastructure. Looking ahead to September, and a new 4-part webinar series on SIP begins on September 16th. Sean Dolan and some guy named Kirk Harnack are the presenters. On September 23rd, John Myatt of Imagine Communications presents SMPTE ST2110 Basics. For information on these and all the webinars by SBE, go to sbe.org/webinars. And the next SBE certification exam window at a local chapter is in November. Applications to take an exam then are due to the national office by September 10th. Also remember, if a local chapter exam is not convenient for you or just not possible because of in-person restrictions, private proctoring is available. The new SBE Specialist Certification, ATSC 3, is available. If you're working with ATSC 3.0, then add the ATSC 3 Specialist letters to your professional title. More information on SBE certification is online at sbe.org/certification. And the SBE is creating its plan for the SBE National Meeting, which will be held in October during the 2021 NAB show. In addition to an SBE Board of Directors meeting, the SBE will present the Membership Meeting and Awards Program, which will provide an update on SBE business and activities, introduce and swear in the newly elected officers and directors, and recognize all the winners from the SBE National Awards. Make your plans to attend the convention and a national meeting now, and join us the afternoon of October 11th for the SBE Membership Meeting and Awards Program. And that is your SBE member update for August 16th, 2021.
Chris, thank you very kindly for all that good information, and you'll find so much of that on the web at the web addresses that were on the screen below, Chris. I like the webinars one, sbe.org/webinars. So, Chris, our guest today is Larry Wilkins, because we had a national program test, an NPT. And Larry, welcome in. I understand you are not only the Director of Engineering at the Alabama Broadcasters Association, but you also hold the title of the Chair of the SBE, the EAS Advisory Group. So welcome in. Good to see you, Larry.
Thank you very much, Kirk and Chris. And to echo what Chris said, I do wear a lot of hats, both with the ABA and the SBE. And I need a hat. I'm sort of all on top of my head, so I could probably put a hat on. One thing I'll correct you on there, just a little bit, Kirk. The NPT stands for National Periodic Test.
Thank you.
Program test.
Gotcha. I'll make a note of that. Periodic, so it happens when? Just whenever? Whenever it's scheduled?
Once a year.
Okay.
Once a year.
Periodically.
Yes, of course. All right. Larry, I've known you for years. By the way, a hat might just make you hotter there in Prattville, Alabama. Is that where you're coming to us from, Prattville?
Yes, I'm in Prattville, Alabama.
Good deal.
That's Prattville.
Prattville, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Talk to us about your role in EAS. Why are you interested in this? And then we're going to jump into what was this periodic test, and what's its purpose, and what happens. But tell us a little bit about Larry Wilkins and why you're doing this.
Well, every state, since the alert system began back in, it actually began way back in 1950s with the old Conrad system, and worked up through EBS and now EAS. But each one of the states is required to have some sort of a EAS committee. And that committee's responsibility is to oversee the implementation of EAS in their state. And as part of that, they're supposed to actually put together a state plan, which shows how the system in the state is configured, who has the authority to issue alerts, so forth and so forth. And then it also has the monitoring assignments for each one of the stations in the state. These plans actually have to be sent to the commission and certified by the commission as accurate. And then they're posted on different websites so that people can go and stations can look at it. My interest started many years ago, I think, when we first wrote the first plan, and I don't really remember what year that was, but one of the reasons I took it over and enjoy doing it is trying to help stations. That's something I always enjoy doing, is help other stations in different areas of their operation. And EAS seems to be an area that either people don't really understand or they let it slide. So we do as much as we can to help stations. So I'm chairman of what's now called the SECC, the State Emergency Communications Committee. And we have a whole committee that meets from time to time to go over things that's happening in the state as it relates to EAS. So I've been doing that for years and enjoy it. Get to meet and talk to a lot of engineers and managers around the state about their EAS operation.
Larry, one of the things that occasionally comes up as either a complaint or a compliment about EAS is the fact that it's done at the state level. And some states are more active, more proactive than others, more organized than others. Some states seems like it took them forever to get a state plan written up, especially with the addition of the IPAWS system. Can you tell us why EAS is done on a state plan? Why not on a regional basis, or maybe a smaller than a state basis, or why not simply on a national basis if the state plans need to be certified by the FCC anyway?
Well, each state has its own responsibilities to the broadcast stations and the cable operators as well in their state, and they have different people that or different agencies that are authorized to issue statewide alerts. So I think that's the reason it's set on a state situation, so that they can assign authorizations to different agencies. In our case, in Alabama, we have like the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency that has the authority to issue amber alerts and blue alerts. We have the emergency management agency that can issue other statewide alerts in the governor's office. So I think it's set up that way so that you can govern. It'd be very hard to do on a regional or almost impossible to do on a statewide basis. But our state plan has to merge and marry right into the national plan. So we work together with the national people to make sure it fits very well with it. So to answer your question, I think that's the reason, because there's so many stations in each state, it will be hard to do on a regional basis.
Gotcha. And I come to think of it, most of the EAS alerts that we get, of course, we're aware that there could always be a presidential level alert. There are the national level tests, like this national periodic test that just happened. Other alerts that we get tend to be weather related, and they're going to be over an area that's for many states smaller than the state. I guess for some smaller states, it could encompass more than one state. And then on the statewide level, we tend to occasionally hear an Amber Alert, which would be typically coming from the state's Bureau of Investigation, like for me, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, for you, the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. So that does make sense. Now, let's move into this national periodic test. What's the purpose of this? Why is it done? And what's supposed to happen?
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of engineers on the call today, and that engineers know how important testing is in their facility. If you've got redundant equipment, backup transmitters or backup STLs or any type of equipment that you're relying on, you want to test it to make sure it works. You don't want to wait till, like a generator, you want to test the generator to make sure it's going to work, and not wait till the power goes off and finds out the battery's dead. Well, the same thing is true with the national EAS system. They want to make sure that if it's called on, which luckily we've never had to implement a national alert since it began in the early 1950s. We've never used it, but we want to make sure that it's available and it works properly. And what the National Periodic Test is to make sure end to end, all the way from the originating facility with FEMA in Washington, makes its way accurately and clearly to all the broadcast facilities all over the United States. So that's the reason they do that. And over the years, the system has changed. And I think, you and I talked about this the other day. It's gone from CONRAD, which started in 1951, and it was not a very good system. A little side note here about what CONRAD was. CONRAD stood for Control of Electromagnetic Radiation. Now that's sort of a long word, but the way it actually worked was rather interesting. This was back in the days of AM radio primarily, and if there was a national alert, all the stations would go off the air, and selected stations would come back on the air operating on 640 or 1240 kilohertz. And they would stay on for a minute or two giving the emergency information, and then they would go off the air, and other stations would come on the air operating on those same frequencies. And the reason for that sort of made sense at the time. Aircraft avionics back in those days was not very sophisticated. And the way a pilot would hone in on where he was going was with the radio station. So to confuse enemy aircraft, so to speak, they would hear maybe a 640 station in Philadelphia for a couple of minutes. That one would go off, and another one would come on 640 in Dallas. And that would sort of so-called confuse the pilot. So that's actually how that started. But that went away in 1963 when we went over to the EBS, the Emergency Broadcast System. And as you remember, if you were working in broadcasting back then, we used to get these little pink envelopes. And I saw one at the station one day when I was doing inspections, which is another one of my hats. I do the ABIP inspections as well. But I saw one of those, and I tried to steal it or ask the guy, could I have it? Because I'd really love to have one of those. These little pink envelopes would have secret codes words on the front for each month and each week. And if you got that over the wire, over the AP wire, whatever wire service you had, you were supposed to look at that and make sure that the code matches. Then you open that envelope and see what the other code word was. that would authenticate an actual alert. The joke about those little envelopes, it said, "Do not open unless you receive an alert." Well, I always opened them when they came in because I wanted to see what was in
Oh
them,
no.
and the reason we thought it was sort of funny because we figured that the Kremlin was on the mailing list for those things as well, so it didn't really matter. But the EBS system had those things, and then that went away again in 1997. And that's when what we have today, the Emergency Alert System, EAS, came out, which has proven to be a very good system, I think. There are a few little weak links in it, but it works very well. And then a little bit later, FEMA decided to add a digital distribution system, which is what we call IPAWS now, the Integrated Public Alert Warning System. And it
Mhm.
doesn't take the place of EAS. It's just another distribution method from FEMA and the FCC. So that's sort of a brief history of how we got to where we are. But this testing, what the testing is all about is to make sure those systems work, both IPAWS and the old system, which is still in place using the PEP system, primary entry point system. That was something that was in long before IPAWS. This last test that we ran last week was using the PEP system. It was not fed over IPAWS, and that makes very good sense to me because the IPAWS is actually fed over the internet. And should we have some national disaster or God forbid, an attack from a foreign country, probably the first thing that would go down would be the internet. And so that would render IPAWS inactive. So they wanted to test the PEP system. The PEP system for years was distributed from Washington via a VHF radio system and then
Mhm.
also a dial-up system where all the PEP stations, there's like about 77, I think, around the country now, and they had a dial-up system that they could call in from FEMA and issue the alert. They added a couple of years ago a VSAT satellite system, and that was what this test was all about last week, was to test the PEP system, which originates in Washington down through the 77 PEP stations scattered around the state. They, in turn, are relayed by state relay networks in the state, and then finally to LP1s and LP2s in your local area. And that's who stations are supposed to be monitoring. So that was a long answer to your short question, but that was what the test was for, was to see how effective they can send the message from Washington to a station through all this distribution.
You know, back years and years ago, I guess a lot of the first step of the distribution, once it got out of the White House or from FEMA, was to AM radio stations. Wasn't it mostly AM radio stations, right? And
That's
of
correct.
course, we know that it doesn't have to be this way, but generally the audio quality that you receive from an AM station is not going to be as good as from an FM station, all other things being equal, which they often never are. Uh, so, but in today's, like I live just a few miles away from WSM AM, 50,000 watt clear station, and they have all kinds of PEP equipment there. They even have, I believe they still have a shortwave receiver there to pick up messages over shortwave. What's been the transition to using more FM stations for initial distribution, or is that the case in fact?
No, it's not. They're
Oh,
still, and I guess it's the way it's been handled over the years. The PEP stations are still AM stations.
mm,
Alabama, for years, had no PEP station. And what we had to do, we had to monitor WSM in Nashville, like you say, and we also monitored WWL out of New Orleans. And that's how we got the national message in from those PEP stations. Now, several years ago, the FEMA and all, they did end up putting a PEP station in Birmingham, which is a 50 kilowatt AM. But that's just the way the system was designed. years ago, and they've just sort of stayed with it. Now, in our state, our relay system is built entirely on FM stations. We do pick up the signal from the WJOX AM in Birmingham, but then it is relayed around the state. We have two statewide relay networks. One is the Alabama Public Television Network, which has 9 transmitters scattered around the state, and the other is the Alabama Public Radio Network, which has several transmitters scattered around the state, all FMs. And so we do transition it over to FM for obvious reasons, but it does start initially with AMs.
What about states where they happen to have maybe a state news network that's distributed via satellite? Are those sometimes used as a way to get word out to lots of stations?
Yes, it does. A lot of states do that. There's some states I know out in on the West Coast. Some of them have their own microwave system or a VHF system, a relay. How they come up with that? A rather unique situation, and I keep referring back to what we do in Alabama because I'm mostly
Sure.
familiar with that.
Yeah.
Several years ago, we came up with the idea of doing just what you said, and we had a network, which another hat that I had, we had installed a satellite network for Auburn and Alabama sports
Oh, okay.
called Alabama Digital Satellite Network, and we distributed both the Auburn and Alabama football games to stations around the state. And so we tied into that, and we could issue statewide alerts over ADSN, the satellite network. Several years down the road, that network was purchased by an out-of-state sports network, and they shut the uplink down. And so we lost that ability. And being forward thinking as the Alabama broadcasters is and has been for years, they decided that they would spend the money to actually put in our own satellite network. So we started out, I think, with about 16 or 17 downlinks scattered around the state at full power FM stations. We have later, and just this year, we just finished up adding. We got a grant from the state, and we added more downlinks. We're up to around 48, nearly 50 downlinks now at area FM stations, and they're all being fed from the 2 statewide networks. So to answer your question, yeah, a lot of states use uh, different ways of getting messages around the state. And the main reason we did this was to cut down the daisy chaining, which we can talk about a little bit later. The disadvantages of using daisy chain station to station to station. But there are a lot of states around in the country that do other ways of distributing other than just daisy chaining.
Daisy chaining is indeed, I've always thought, a real weakness in the system. Unless you monitor several stations, which I guess you typically will do. Uh, in fact, I often wondered why on a national level there wasn't more use made of like National Public Radio satellite distribution or any of the other commercial news networks like CBS or what used to be Mutual News or ABC and so forth, Fox News Radio, for example. Is there any participation of with those organizations?
Oh yeah, NPR has on their what they call their Squawk channel, NPR One. They actually sent the test down, and they do regularly send the test down on their Squawk channel. Also, XM Sirius actually sends it out over their channel 184, I think, the free channel or whatever they call that free channel. They
Mm-hmm.
used to do weekly tests. I think now they just do monthly tests, and they did the NPT test last week as well. And I think there's been some discussion over the years with some of the major networks to do something like that, but it never has gotten really off the ground. But that would be good to do that. The daisy chain system, as you say, is a weak link, and uh, that was one reason we put in our satellite network was to
Yeah.
minimize the number of hops that you have to go through.
So this past Wednesday at I believe it was 2:20 p.m. Eastern time, there was supposed to be this national periodic test. What? How did that go? Did you have some successes? Did you have some challenges, things that we need to work on for next time?
Well, each time they run these tests, they do FEMA and FCC ends up doing a poll, and it takes several months to get all the data together from all the
Mm.
states, obviously. And over the years, the success rate has not been overwhelming for various reasons, but each year it gets a little better and a little better. Uh, the main areas seem to be one in maybe in the distribution, and then other errors come up at an individual station where they may have their equipment may be defective, or they may be monitoring the wrong people or something like that. But I think this year we actually have had a conference call. FEMA had a conference call right after the test last week, and
Mhm.
all the state chairs were supposed to be on that meeting, and they reported how it went in their state. There were several issues that popped up around the country, and we had a few in Alabama as well. We really had what I thought was a really good success rate. We had of the stations that we're monitoring, which we can talk about that a little bit later. We had like about uh, close to like a 90% success rate, which was really good.
Oh my. Hmm.
But there were some errors, and the same errors we had in Alabama was what we heard on the conference call. And we can talk about those if you want to briefly right now. Well,
Yeah, it's
one of the
always
yeah.
just like it's always good to look at aircraft accidents to find out what went wrong, what can we do to keep that from happening again, and of course things where it went right. Well, we kind of take that for granted because that's the way it was supposed to run. We don't always clap our hands and cheer for those things that went right because that's the way the system was designed. So what kind of things did go wrong?
Yeah, you're right there. You don't learn by success. You learn by failures, as somebody told me one time, and that's exactly right. Well, one of the problems we heard on the conference call and on social media, I've seen a lot of comments about this, was one of the things was they got the header of the alert, but no audio.
Hmm.
And so we I sort of sat down and tried to figure that out, and contacted people that were having that trouble. And I don't this is what I found out, and I don't know if this is a situation statewide, but I'll mention this so people can see. The errors occurred mostly for in states that use TV stations to relay the message at some point in the relay system,
Hmm.
and if this station was picking up that television station via a cable system, not over the
Hmm.
air. And
Hmm.
what we discovered, and after discussion with the manufacturers, all three major manufacturers, was that we discovered that if an alert was issued and a TV station sent out the message, and your EAS device was in the process of of configuring it, getting ready to send it out, because it's not instantaneous. It's a few seconds delay. It's got to get everything together, and it records it and plays it back. It doesn't do it live, and it can record and play back at the same time, so you don't have to wait the entire length.
Ah,
But what we
right.
discovered was if while your EAS device is processing the alert, the cable system interrupts with their version of it, the EAS box would see it as two headers of the same type, and it would think it's an error, and it would dump both of them. That was one of the problems that we found here in Alabama, and that
Mm.
I know that one of the cable companies in Alabama, and I had a finally found somebody that was in the know at their head end, and the way they issue alerts over the cable, if they get an alert, regardless of what channel you're watching on your cable,
Right.
it force tunes your cable box to channel one. And that's where they uh, display the EAS alert. When the alert is over, it releases it and switches back to whatever channel you were watching at the time. So that was one of the situations we discovered that it happened in that time frame. The EAS box was processing the alert, and while it was processing the alert, the cable system interrupted it with theirs, and the EAS box said, "Oh, I see the header twice. That's an error," and it dumped them both.
And you would think that this situation would have come up before and would have been recognized and fixed before. Why do you think this was a new condition where the EAS boxes decided it was an error and dropped it?
I don't know. I think this has happened before, and there
Hmm.
may be more stations now, more states that may be using television, and you have a lot of stations that are maybe not in a position that they can pick the station up off the air, or
Right.
they can get it off their local cable,
Hmm.
and they get poor signal off the air, so they put in a cable box and pick it up, which is perfectly legal as far as the FCC is concerned because you're monitoring
Hmm.
it, but
Hmm.
you can run into that problem.
Is there any other explanation aside? And you sleuthed this one. Is there any other? Because I heard a number of stations here in the Nashville area that had the similar thing. They heard the initial squawks and then either dead air or just barely moving the needle with some audio. It may have been a different problem. Uh, did you come up with any other scenarios that could have caused some of the other problems that we heard, or the same problem?
Yeah, the another problem it really wasn't a problem with the audio, and it
Hmm.
didn't really matter because it didn't have anything to do with the message. But there was a lot of stations complaining they heard three and four and maybe five uh, alert tones. When it
Mm,
started, you would hear three or four or five alert tones back to back before the message ever started.
yeah.
That was pretty easy to understand because in daisy chaining, typically, if you're going in and out of several stations, unless they have configured their box in a way that it would not add a another alert tone, you would get the first one, and you'd go through the first relay, and it would add theirs. Then it would add another one at the next station. So by the time it got down to you, if it had been relayed like four times, you would get that alert four separate times. So that was another issue that we saw. And when I looked at it, I said, "Well, duh, that's the way daisy chaining work." Now there is a workaround
Hmm.
in some of the boxes that you can go in and actually, especially on that particular alert, like MPT, you can
Hmm.
go in and program it not to add another alert tone because the very initial one from FEMA had an alert tone on it, so you didn't need to repeat it again.
Speaking of FEMA and this particular test this past Wednesday, I understand, and you touched on this, but I want to make sure I understand that this was done without IPAWS. This was just the PEP station distribution. Do I have that right?
That is correct. They have done the periodic test a few years ago using IPAWS to
Hmm.
test that system to make sure it works. And so they decided that they needed to test in case the internet was down.
Yeah.
They wanted to make sure they could get a message out from the White House, so they did it only on PEP. It was not available on IPAWS.
So we will. I'll ask you in a few minutes about your monitoring system in Alabama because I think that's pretty clever, what you've set up there. But let's talk about now that the test happened. What are the reporting requirements that stations have? Was there something immediate? Is there something on a little further down the road that they need to fill out and say what happened?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
The FEMA actually came up several years ago with a reporting system, primarily so they could see how it went across the United States, and so they created a something called ETRS, Test Reporting System, and you were by I forget what the date was. You had to fill out Form One beforehand, which was actually just a uh, data information about your station, where you were, where your transmitter was located, what city you're in, and all that kind of stuff, and who was going to be responsible the day of the test and all that stuff, and who you were monitoring. And then on the day of the test, which was last Wednesday, the 11th, you were to fill out Form 2 and submit that either that day or by midnight on the 12th, I believe it was, just so we had 2 days to get it out. That was
Mhm.
an easy one to fill out because there was only two questions. One said, "Did you receive the test? Yes or no?" And the second question, did you relay the test? Yes or no?
Mm-hmm.
Then there is a Form 3, which you can go ahead and fill out now, and most people do so they don't forget it. The actual date that is required or deadline is sometime in September 27th or somewhere around that. But that goes into more detail. It asks you who you received it from, and if you had any type of a problem and what that problem was, and you got to fill that out in detail. And did you transmit it, or if you had problems transmitting it? And so there were actually 3 forms that had to be filled out: one before the test, one the day of the test, and then another one that where you would fill out if there were any problems.
We're talking with Larry Wilkins. He is the Director of Engineering for the Alabama Broadcasters Association. He's also the chair of the SBE's EAS Advisory Group. I'm Kirk Harnack on the SBE WEBxtra. Chris Shearer is along too, and he's going to be mopping up with questions I forgot to ask. So I appreciate Chris being here as well. Larry is talking about the National Periodic Test that happened last Wednesday. It came down from FEMA, did not include IPAWS. The idea was to test the PEP system. Larry, remind me what PEP stands for.
Primary entry point.
Primary entry point. As I always
right.
thought it was a peak envelope something or other. So primary entry point.
That's TV.
Oh, okay. All right. So let's talk about this monitoring system that you've got in Alabama, which you described that to me briefly a few days ago. And I thought, well, that's genius. That wasn't all that hard to do. And it gives you some pretty quick feedback on how any testing, how things are going. And so talk about what you got there.
Okay, but before I actually do that, one thing I want to mention about another issue that I forgot to mention.
Yeah.
There was an issue about quality of the audio. Now, obviously, as you go through daisy chaining, each time you go through another station, things happen, the processing and all that. But one of the things we noticed this year, and we had a long conversation back and forth between several engineers and the manufacturers, the reason it really gets messed up now is when this all came about years ago and they developed the daisy chain method, we were all analog. Now we're digital. And you especially understand what happens when you go in and out of digital systems 3 or 4 times, and every station has got a processor. You go in through A to D converters, D to A converters. You go in sometimes transcoding. And I know we had on our monthly engineering webinars that the ABA does every month, we had a mix engineer, Andrew Shep, who's a Grammy-winning engineer with us, and he made a comment. He said, transcoding is of the devil. He said, nobody can disagree with me that if you try to transcode from one already compressed file to another compressed file, it's going to sound terrible. So if you think about it, the very first station that gets the alert, well, let's back up. The PEP station that got the alert in Birmingham came in off of a VSAT satellite system, but it went through the processor before it got to their AM transmitter. Then it was picked up by another station off the air, went through their processor to their transmitter, and so on down the line. And every time you go in there, there's always some digital part of a processor nowadays. So you just can't go in and out of digital stuff a lot of times, and they're usually not set the same. And that really made what we noticed was, and I listened to it coming right off the VSAT, and it was very good. It sounded very clean. I also listened to it coming off of NPR, and it was studio quality. But after you went through 2 or 3 hops and all the processing and the digital converting and up converting, it began to get a little hollow sounding, and that's just due to the lost bits. And I'm sure you've run into that from time to time as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for letting us remember that. I also thought of another problem that might affect some people, and that is in markets where you have PPM markets, where you have encoding for measuring of audience. Right. I always wondered, if I'm in a big market, let's say I don't know if any of the Alabama markets are PPM markets, but let's just say Birmingham, Alabama was, and they're transmitting is the EAS in relay, is the injection of EAS, does that tend to be before or after the Nielsen encoding? And problem still exists for television as well. You've got encoding going on there. My point is, could other stations down the line be transmitting the Nielsen encoding tones, the PPM tones of a station 2 or 3 back, and all of a sudden a station in Birmingham has listeners all over the entire state of Alabama, according to Nielsen. Of course, there wouldn't be PPM monitors so much out in the sticks, so to speak. But I always thought that was kind of interesting, that whatever's going on there. Years ago in Mississippi, I have some stations there. We had an early test of a system there, and the originating station forgot to send the end of message tones at the end of this thing, right? And so for a while, all the stations down the line were transmitting whatever was on that radio station. Well, they went into a spot break, and they had a dry cleaning spot. And it was good to know that if there's a dry cleaning emergency in Mississippi, we're covered. It's all over the state. We can get that we can get that statewide.
Anyway, yeah, that could very well happen.
I'm sure there's unintended consequences, but the point here is get the word out. So speaking of checking all over the state, tell me about this monitoring system you've got in Alabama.
All right. And we had, as we mentioned before, the agency, the state agency in our state that has the authorization, and it goes through the Alabama Emergency Management Agency to set up all the authorizations. But the agency that has the authorization to issue Amber Alerts is the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency. And I got a call from that agency a day after they ran an Amber Alert one night, and they called me the next day and said, we ran an Amber Alert last night. And I said, yeah, I know. And they said, do you have any record of how well it was distributed around the state? Well, I sort of sat there. If I'd been in a meeting with them, I'm sure I would have been red-faced, because I said, well, no, we don't really have any way to know, unless I send an email or call the engineer or somebody to see, did you get it and did you relay it? So we got to thinking about it. Is there some way that we can actually monitor these devices that are out in the field? And we discovered that some of the manufacturers will allow you to send the data from alerts to an FTP site. So the Alabama Broadcast Association already had a FTP site set up where they send all their PEP spots and all around the stations. So I said, let's try this. So we actually created another folder in the FTP site called /EAS logs. And then we went to a station and we programmed that information into the FTP section of their configuration file. And lo and behold, every time they would send something, it would send a report to that FTP site. That has grown now. We're monitoring 164 different EAS boxes around the state. And so we know within a minute's notice or a second's notice, what they got and what they didn't. And I keep a master database, and I don't keep up with everything because it would take me a day and a half to do it, but I keep a database of who received the required monthly test and the NPT like we did last week. And sometimes I will double check the IPAWS. The IPAWS test is fed every Monday at 11 o'clock each time zone. And so I can see at a minute's glance who is receiving it and who's not. We really haven't had any problems getting stations to agree to do this because they love it, because it's another set of eyes watching their EAS box. If I see that a station has been missing something that they're required to receive or to activate on, then I'll just drop an email to the engineer and say, you need to check your monitor 1 or your monitor 2 or your IPAWS to see what your problem is. So it gives another set of eyes of watching these. And we create this database and we can do it. An interesting note, when we put the satellite system in and we got it all working and we set up this monitoring system, we actually had a meeting with the FCC at the Atlanta office. And as we do annually, the ABIP inspectors in the Southeast go up to Atlanta and meet with the commission once a year to go over issues that we're finding at stations. But while it happened to be on the day that we were going to run the monthly test, so the regional director and all his assistants were sitting around the conference table, and I made mention. I said, "We're going to run a monthly test for the state of Alabama. I can do it right here from my iPad." And then I said, "Once it's over, I can show you how many people actually got the test." So I opened up the iPad and I sent the test. And I said, "Now," he said, "how long is it going to take you to get the data? You got to wait for them to mail it in or email it in?" I said, "No, as soon as I can change screens, you can see it." So I changed screen and looked at the FTP, and here come all these reports from 160 something stations. And he like to fell out of his chair. He said, "Oh, boy, that's really great." So that has really been a real big feature for us, especially for the SECC, the committee, because it gives us a way to continuously check the health of our state distribution system. We can see when alerts are sent, if they're getting it, or if there's a region that didn't get it, or a station's not getting it, and then we can go and address that. And now that we have our satellite network, I can actually send tests uh, on the satellite to see how well all my downlinks are working. I can see if a downlink is out, and then I can we have a repair guy that goes and works on our downlinks. So I do that like twice a month. I'll run a test on our satellite system, but I can see that coming back on our monitor system. The great thing about it, Kirk, it doesn't cost anybody anything. It's a zero cost. And we already had the FTP server. It doesn't cost the station anything. They don't have to do. They don't even know it's working. We just
Right.
program it
Right.
into. We just program it into it.
Wow. Wow. So using the FTP capability already built into some of the brands of EAS devices.
Right.
Yeah.
There was one brand that didn't have that set up. You
Hmm.
couldn't send anything to an FTP site. Well, as a workaround, I said, why don't you go in? All of them have a setup in there where you can email the engineer
Right.
how if it got a test. I created a Gmail account, Alabama SECC at gmail.com. I said, enter that in there since they don't have the ability to do FTP. So those particular stations, I get an email from them, and I just incorporate that in the database as well. The only negative thing, and I've had stations call about it, or states call to ask how we were doing that because they'd like to do it. It takes a person to do it. And I do it in the mornings over my first cup of coffee. I'll go and go down through the database. Unfortunately, I haven't found anybody that has any software that would do it automatically. It would be neat if it could look at that data that I'm getting from the FTP site and actually, I can break it down by filtering out like weather alerts, which I don't monitor. I filter all those out,
Hmm.
and stations sending email weekly tests. I don't look at those, so I can filter all that out. But when you're doing 164 stations, like today with the IPAWS test at 11 o'clock, I mean, there was a ton of stuff down, and I just walked through it while I drink my coffee.
Gotcha. Gotcha. I have with more and more radio stations being programmed and controlled from central locations, as TV stations have been doing for some years, central casting. I think we're going to find more of the EAS units will be part of an ecosystem where they can report. I mean, there won't. I don't think there'll be cross brand functionality, but within a certain brand. If a broadcaster is in a regional or a nationwide situation, I think they're going to find some tools available in the future to help them manage that for themselves, and maybe they can all report into a database or a state database like yours. I want to bring Chris Shearer in, Chris, to ask you about what else we haven't asked about, or if there's any question in your mind that you'd like to get answered from Larry Wilkins.
Well, Larry mentioned Andy Sheps, and I got to do the throw myself on the coattails here. Andy and I went to college together. We're both
Really?
graduates of we're both graduates of the Music Engineering Technology program at the University of Miami. When Ken
Right.
Pullman, if those of you in the digital audio world remember his name, was the program chair. So, needless to say, Andy's path, career path, and my path kind of went different directions, but we're fellow alumni. So it's funny when I get to hear of some of my former classmates and other areas coming back into the broadcast side. So that's a bit.
He's a brilliant mix engineer, and
Yep.
we had him on our conference call. He's in the music mixing business, but I
Mhm.
listened to one of his webinars one time, and everything he talked about of things that he does when he's mixing a record, I said, well, those things apply to somebody sitting in a production room at a radio station cutting a car dealership spot on a digital audio workstation. So I called him up. He's in London now, so I got a hold of him, and he agreed to be on our program, and it was most informative.
Very good. Yeah, very very smart guy. Was then, still is now. But yeah, I know him. Haha. um, looking at the on the YouTube channel feed, a couple of questions popped up, and I think we hit most of them. There was one comment that said it has to do with the filtering of the header tones. Someone thought that he thought if the audio levels are set correctly on the decoder, it should filter the tones automatically and replace them with fresh tones. According to what you said, that has to be set up in the program or in the operational settings of the unit. Is that true, or are we talking perhaps different manufacturers do it in different ways?
I think different manufacturers do it differently. I do know that one of the manufacturers told me that the way it's set up, it is supposed to, if there is a setting in there for the sensitivity of hearing the alert tone, and it's supposed to dump the one that comes in and replaces it with the one out of your own box. Now, the problem is with this particular manufacturer, it will only do the first one. So if you had three or four, it would only drop one. So you would still end up with multiple tones. You can go in and readjust that. Uh, uh, my understanding, I'm going to play around with that with the unit I have here and see if that works. But I think the problem is if you have more than two, then that gets a little complicated. The unit doesn't, it only drops the first one.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, interesting to see if you get a chance to do your bench test, what you come up with, if you find a fix or a workaround for that. A question here that I can't say I'm fully up to speed on, so I'm just going to read it. Any information related to the reception of WEA test alerts? Why test using an opt-in system? Why not use the EAN code instead of NPT for the once a year National EAS WEAA test?
The EAN is specifically designed and relegated to a national alert from the White House. So that would I think that's what FEMA told me. They could not use EAN because that's dedicated for an actual alert. So they had to come up, and so they used the NPT.
Okay.
That makes sense. Makes sense.
One other question from the list. Someone asks if you could comment a little bit more on the FCC alert reporting system portal. He says he's revising his state plan and the new system is not user friendly. No surprise.
Oh, I know what he's talking about. This is something that affects only, and I think this is what he's talking about. This affects the state committees, and they have come up with a new system where right now all the state plans, there is no form, and all the state plans are different, although they have the required information in it. They all look different, and they're filed with the commission. And so what FEMA has come up with is a standardized form for the state plan. And I think we have the last meeting we had with the folks at FEMA. We have a year to get that completed. We have to migrate the material that is actually in the paper or in the state plan that we have now. We have to migrate the required information over into a specified form that they have come up with. Now, if that's what he's talking about, that form is a little. I have a sample copy of it. I've been working with Gary Tim, who's very up on this, and he and I have been going back and forth on it, and it is a little hard to go through, as most FCC forms are and FEMA forms are. But if that's not the report he's talking about, if it's the other one where you actually go in to fill out Form 1, 2, and 3, the neat thing about it is it self-populates itself. The stuff that you file, well, we didn't do one last year, but in 2019, all the data in there self-populates when you go through. So that makes it easy. So I hope I'm talking about the same thing he asked a question about.
He said, yes, that's it. So you hit it on the head. Way to go, Larry.
Good feedback. Folks, we're about out of time. I want to ask Larry if you have any suggested resources for stations that want to make sure that maybe they were prepared, maybe they weren't quite prepared, maybe the test went well, didn't go well for them at this point. Larry, what do you suggest that engineers, station owners, chief operators do to make sure they're better prepared for not only the next test, but for the next real life event, whether it's a weather, child abduction emergency, whatever is something from their state Bureau of Investigation? What do you suggest people do to get themselves better ready?
The best thing to do is to make sure you follow your state plan, go in the state plan and make sure that you're monitoring, first of all, monitoring the correct source. Those are laid out in every state plan who you're supposed to be monitoring. Most of them will list several in your area that are listed as LP1s and LP2s. So you have to monitor one of those monitor sources. And remember, that does not include IPAWS, nor does it include the National Weather Service. It has to be 2 radio stations or TV station or some other type of source that is feeding information. According to the commission rules, it has to be one that can relay an EAN from the White House. And secondly, make sure that the firmware on your device is up to date. We did have some errors occur this time where people were running the wrong software. They had old software. And with that in mind, August 21st, everybody will have to update their devices to the new security certificate from FEMA. It expires August 21st, and if you don't upgrade your device by that date, you will no longer be able to validate messages from IPAWS, which will render your device non-compliant with commission rules. So don't forget to do that. You can contact your equipment manufacturer on the process, or your SECC in your state. They know how that's done on all 3. So that's the main thing. Make sure your firmware is up to date and make sure that you're monitoring the correct system and that the chief operator is checking that system log once a week. I don't know. I can't tell you how many people we run into that's not doing that. So check that every week.
I'd like to add that station engineers should really work to make sure that you're receiving your assignments well. You've got some room in your carrier to noise ratio. Put an outdoor antenna up if you need to. Put something on the roof. Put something on your STL tower. Whatever you need to do to pick up your assignment properly. If you need to buy an antenna to pick up your NOAA weather transmitter, do that. If you need to put up a directional antenna outdoors to pick up a faraway FM assignment, or a loop antenna, a shielded loop for your AM assignment, do that. Yes, it's a pain, but do a good job with that. You'll ensure much better reception and better tests and better audio when that audio has to go on your station.
Yeah, and check the level of that audio. All these devices that are out there now are digital. And most of the meters on these units are reading in dBFS, not dBm. And so that throws a curve to some people that don't know what dBFS is. So make sure that you've got the correct level and quality, as you say.
Yeah, good deal. We've been talking to Larry Wilkins. Larry is the Director of Engineering for the Alabama Broadcasters Association, also the chair of the SBE's EAS Advisory Group. Larry, I appreciate you very much being with us. Thanks for appearing on our show from Prattville, Alabama.
My privilege, Kirk.
All righty. And we'll throw it back to Chris Shearer, who will take us out. Chris, thank you very much.
And thank you. This has been the SBE WEBxtra, the SBE chapter of the web. We present this monthly. and we hope you'll join us each time. We'll post the replay on our YouTube channel, usually within a day or so. The SBE Webxtra is sponsored by Catrine, whom we thank for the support. Catrine, unique experience, individual solutions, reliable performance. If you hold SBE certification, viewing the SBE Webxtra qualifies you for 1/2 point in Category G, that's attendance, just like attending a local chapter meeting. And that does it for this installment of the SBE Webxtra from the Society of Broadcast Engineers, the Association for Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Professionals. Thanks again to our guest, Larry Wilkins, and on behalf of Kirk Harnack, we'll see you next month.